Hello and welcome to a new episode here on the Wars Rebellion podcast for Age Civil War. I'm your host, Niels Eichhorn, from what started as a nice sunny day here in North Germany, but I'm very certain that my guests today have still a very nice sunny afternoon. And we're doing a very European edition today because my guests are in Rome today, which is quite a nice thing. I didn't have to deal with time differences. So today we are going to talk about a new book from LSU Press, Zouave Theater, Transnational Military Fashion and Performance, which is about a year old. I'm a little behind with LSU books here. And the authors, will start with the lady, of course, Carol Harrison. She is a professor at the University of South Carolina and also the author of, for example, Romantic Catholics, France's Post-Revolutionary Generation in Search of a Modern Faith, and The Bourgeois Citizen in 19th Century France, Gender, Sociability, and the Use of Emulation. Quite interesting. Then we also have with us Thom J. Brown, who is also a professor of history at the University of South Carolina. And he is the author of, for example, Dorothy Dix, New England Reformers. And then, of course, his prize-winning Tom Watson Brown Book Award, Civil War Monuments and the Militarization of America. So I'm so happy that you two took the time from your sightseeing and work in Rome to join me today for this. So, how did you two decide to write about the Zouaves, of all things, Civil War and French history?
Well, the Zouave interest started with me, and might not expect this, but it actually started with the material on the Pontifical Zouave. So I'm a historian of Roman Catholicism, and I first became interested in the Zouave years ago. I wrote an article about French Zouave volunteers, so young men who went to Rome to volunteer to defend the Pope against the forces of the Italian Risorgimento. And so I wrote about these young men, and I wrote about the biographies their families produced of them, especially after they died. And one of the questions I was interested in is, and the article wasn't really about this, but why in the world would young men who were devout Catholics, who were going to Rome to defend the Pope, decide to adopt a military uniform that was out of the French army and that represented France's effort to kind of channel Muslim tribesmen's dress? And it wasn't accidental, and they knew what they were doing. They had very clear ideas about why this was a good idea. But that was really the beginning of the project, was an interest in this major adoption of the Zouave uniform in Rome. And from there, I thought there's a good article in the international diffusion of the Zouave uniform, and I brought Thom on board. Married him as well. And so, of course, he's a Civil War historian. And it turned out that there was a lot more than just one article. It was unmanageable for one article. And so we wound up with a full book.
So, how much arm wrestling did it take to get you on board, Tom?
Oh, I recognize it was a good idea. It took us a little while before we reached the right stage in our projects, and so we had several years to kick this idea around the dinner table before we really had a chance to focus on it. But when we did, we were very excited about it.
So, since you're saying dinner table, so how much of the book thinking about it, writing took place at the dinner table as sort of conversation at home?
Oh, a lot of it.
A lot,
Yeah.
a lot. We'd be doing our research and come up with sort of a fascinating tidbits to talk about, and ideas for sections or themes, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a great way to collaborate, right? When you don't sort of have to schedule meetings, they happen every evening naturally. And yeah, it was great fun to be working on the same project. I should say we worked on this through the pandemic as well. And so it was really nice when we were stuck at home together to have a project that we were both working on. And so a lot of the actual getting to the book happened during the pandemic. And that was really nice.
Oh, okay. Wow. And we briefly talked about this before we started that you asked me of kind of how the book felt, so if you could tell the different authors in this, and I couldn't tell that. I mean I knew Thom was working Civil War and you were more French history, European history, so I kind of had a feeling that each of you wrote certain sections primarily, but how did the writing go? Did each of you write the section on like the French? Carol, did you write that and Thom wrote the Civil War and then you kind of cross-edited? How did that go for you guys?
Yeah, that is largely how we did it. So yeah, the French chapters, the Roman chapter are mostly me. The Civil War chapters are mostly Thom. We did edit each other's work. We wrote the first and the last and the epilogue all together. I mean, we there are parts, some of it's mine, some of it's Thom's.
Hmm.
But I'm really pleased to hear that it doesn't sound very much like two different voices.
Hmm.
And sometimes we made decisions that something that, we started out in one of my chapters and we would decide it really belonged in the Civil War chapter.
Hmm.
So material on the Italian campaign where French Zouave served in Italy, for instance, I started writing it, then we decided really it made sense to put it in the chapter on the Civil War because the press coverage out of the Italian campaign is really what brought Zouave to U.S. attention.
Hmm.
So, there are a few pages of my prose got exported into Thom's chapter, but for the most part, they're Thom's chapters and they're my chapters.
It's probably fair to say that, we envisioned our reader as being, it's an English language book, mostly American readers, probably needed a little bit more background on, the Italian campaign or even the Crimean War than on, the Civil War broadly.
Mm-hmm.
So we provide a little more background, I think, on the European parts.
Yeah.
Right. So that would have been like the challenge for you, Carol, to kind of think about like what doesn't Thom know that I need to tell the readers in the US that
Yeah. So we did,
Exactly.
and Thom, this was really helpful to be working together to think about like where do you need, if you're imagining a book that's written for a U.S. readership, what do they need to know about, say, the French colonization of Algeria, or the Third Republic, or something like that?
there's a lot. Especially the second, I like the Second Empire, and that's a very confusing period, obviously, for a lot of American historians. And so, how do you perceive of your book? Do you think of your book sort of as a like transnational story, as sort of material culture story of like there's a theatrics in there? So where do you feel like the best genre for your book is?
That's a tough one. We were really curious to see, what the call number would be.
Oh.
Um, because you're right, it falls into a variety of
Mhm.
camps, and it's hard to pick one. The call number basically is in the area of military uniforms, which I think is a pretty reasonable decision by whoever decides call numbers. I mean, the uniform is kind of at the heart of it all.
Mhm.
And there are books in that on that shelf from all over the world, and I think this fits in to that company. Um, yeah.
But I also think it's, I mean, from my perspective, maybe not so much yours, but it's a global history of France. It's a history that takes one important piece of French culture, in this particular case, material culture, a uniform, and traces it as it moves around the globe. And it's a good hook for hanging a global history of France on, because the Zouave uniform has this sort of meteoric rise and disappears almost equally quickly, at least on a global stage. There is this moment in the late 50s and early 1860s when everybody is wearing Zouave uniforms, And by the end of the century, it's retreated back to kind of its French homeland. So yeah, I like to think of it as a global history of France.
Okay.
And then just one more take on the same answer, same question. When it comes time to pick a title, I'm pleased with where we landed. I think the theaters underscores, how important stage performance was to the book. That I thought was really exciting once we got into it. The relationship between, military performance and, commercial theatrical performance was, I think, really exhilarating topic.
And something I at least did not see coming.
Yeah.
I thought we were writing a kind of uniforms, military uniforms, fashion history. But the extent to which the Zouave was a theatrical character and shaped both French and American theatrical traditions, I did not. When we started this, I didn't know that it would be about that.
It was a really fun discovery.
Yeah.
So reading through the New York Clipper, and
So just out of curiosity, what was your initial working title?
I think we probably, that's a good question I think the Zouave moment. That we envisioned it as the history of a fad, which in many ways it is, and we use the phrase Zouave moment.
It's one of the chapter titles.
As a title, yes, for the title of the introduction, I guess it is. And we are especially focused on that, the period when the Zouave uniform is all over. But in the end, we decided, the Zouave story in France really goes on quite a long time. And so the moment thing didn't feel completely true to that. And as you said, we wanted to underscore the theater's part.
Yeah. And we talked briefly about just calling it Zouave, possibly with an exclamation mark. Yes. You don't see that. We don't think we'll ever get a chance to write a book with an exclamation mark in the title after that. Right. And we thought about that, and we rejected that because one of the interesting things about writing this book is that Zouaves are a lot of fun. They're tricksters. There are a lot of jokes. There are pratfalls. There are gags. And the Zouave with an exclamation mark kind of captured that. But we felt like it risked underplaying the fact that these are colonial troops. These are troops that committed atrocities, that this is a serious book. And so one of the things that we did the whole way through is try to capture and explain the fun, because you need to understand the fun to explain why it was such a powerful fad, but also without diminishing the fact that all of this fun and the jokes and the gags are a way of concealing or of making more palatable colonialist violence. And we didn't want to lose sight of that.
Right. Yeah, of course. And that's sort of the balancing act that the book has to strike between sort of the military side of things and then the popular perception of some in that. So very briefly, for I assume most of the people that will listen are familiar with what the Zouaves looked like, but just give us a sense of was it always sort of the red pants, blue jacket? What you have pictures with regard to Rome, so I'm kind of especially thinking about your Italians eventually there.
There are color variations. The French original is the red trousers, like all French infantrymen, and the blue jacket. But there are color variations as the Zouave uniform travels. But generally speaking, the elements of it are always the really baggy trousers, right? The enormously baggy trousers and the open jacket, right? So a jacket that doesn't have a collar and that doesn't button up. So the jacket that allows you freedom of movement. And those are those two pieces. They're variations on headgear. The Pope decided that his soldiers were not wearing turbans. So, the pontifical Zouaves didn't wear a turban.
That would have been cute, though. You got to admit that.
And they wear gray. They wear gray instead of the bright red and blue. But the wide trousers and the open jacket, I think, are the key pieces. And they were central to the appeal of the uniform. Why people like to wear this. It was comfortable, especially if you think about other 19th century military uniforms. It was comfortable. It assumed that the soldier was going to be free to move across the battlefield to show some initiative. And that's an important part of the appeal.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. So far as the variety goes, I think an important difference between the European chapters and the American chapters is that in France, the institutional home of the Zouaves is the French army, a highly centralized institution. And in Rome, of course, it's the papal army. In the United States, the institutional home is the militia, and then the United States volunteers, and then back to the militia after the Civil War, and highly decentralized institutionally. So there's a great deal more variety in terms of what the uniforms look like. There's way more detailed differences, but the broad themes are the ones that Carol mentions that the French Army established: the freedom of movement, the way that's going to empower individual infantrymen to have agency and initiative, and elan, and also the flair of the whole thing. It looked good.
Yeah, I mean, everybody was aware that these troops just looked great. They looked really good.
Of course, I remember that you had this very interesting section there at the start with regard to the color, right? Like red. It stands out. You can see that.
Well, that, as Carol said, in France, the red trousers are.
French soldiers wear red trousers up until the First World War. And even during the First World War, when the First World War is important because up until really the 1880s, excuse me, battlefields were covered with so much black smoke that, hiding from the enemy was not really an issue. There was very little aimed fire over any kind of distance. The advantage of the Zouave uniform, it was a much bigger advantage that your fellow soldiers could find you. That kind of visibility was important. So uniforms that were striking in their color, in their silhouette, so that you could identify the other members of the unit, that was really important. The First World War, which is also the war when the term camouflage is coined, this is the first moment where armies really systematically start to think about uniforms that will be invisible. And there is a big debate within the French army about getting rid of red trousers for infantrymen. And there is a famous French general who basically says, no, we are not going to do this. And he says, le pantalon rouge, c'est la France, that red trousers are what make the French soldier. And that it is a great affront to national identity to imagine dressing your soldiers in anything else. So the red trousers are there. The elan is important. The aesthetic appeal to recruit soldiers is important. The idea that people can see you over a distance and shoot you is really not that big an issue. And I will say that the first khaki uniforms that enter the British Army in India, of course, khaki becomes a good camouflage color, but the first khaki uniforms are worn in India by soldiers who are wearing khaki with a bright red sash.
Hey.
Right across their middle.
Yep. Though, as a German, I will assume that a lot of German soldiers in the First World War would have appreciated French red pants on the battlefield.
France did switch, yes.
They did.
They did give up.
That is the point at which they switch.
Yes. Yeah. But basically, and that's when the Zouave stops becoming a combat outfit.
It becomes a dress uniform,
yeah.
A parade uniform.
So this also sort of goes to Carol, because interestingly enough, during the 19th century and most of the 19th century, till 48 really, and then it sort of switched, red is also usually the color of revolution. So how do you see that kind of, does that play into the decision a little bit here, or is that kind of just?
I don't think it plays into the decision particularly, but certainly the Zouave uniform is a sort of democratic badge almost. Right. Traditionally, if you look at old regime armies and then immediate post-revolution uniforms, the splashy uniforms are worn by officers, right? It's officers who wear the really fancy outfits, especially cavalry officers. And uniforms for the rank and file are pretty, they have red trousers, but they're pretty straightforward. The Zouave uniform breaks with that tradition. Zouave officers wore traditional French infantry officer uniforms. So they're wearing tight trousers, straight tight trousers. They're wearing jackets that are very tightly buttoned up to a very tight collar. And so the Zouave uniform it hands the splashy outfit to the rank and file. And then it also, of course, suggests that these are rank and file soldiers who will be showing initiative on the battlefield, who will make decisions, who will not just be standing sort of shoulder to shoulder in a formation. And that's appealing. And then that is, I think, why so much Zouave lore emerges of stories of cheeky soldiers with their raids into North African villages, their backtalk, their daring do, their ability to forage creatively. All of that really emerges out of the fact that the soldier is more autonomous. He's more of an individual than traditional soldiering had imagined.
Yes. And that ideology plays over in the United States too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to ask sort of like later on, but we can bring this up now already was for you, Thom, because like usually when you imagine the American Civil War armies, it's like shoulder to shoulder advancing across a field, and then you bring the Zouaves in, and it's like that's not their identity. So part of me was like, are they just dressing like Zouaves, or are they actually embracing fully Zouave identity when they're doing this in the United States during the Civil War?
Well, the Zouave is basically a small unit, right? An organization. They're made up of Zouave. There's Zouave regiments. There's sometimes there's Zouave companies. They're not generally organizations of a size that they will, dictate the fighting, techniques. So, a lot of Zouaves fought the same way in the Civil War that ordinary infantry fought, no question. But they had their moments, they have their moments when they get to make the bayonet charge. And when they did, it goes down in memory. Right. So Hawkins Zouaves makes one of the kind of celebrated bayonet charges of the war in the Outer Banks of North Carolina and Burnside's expedition, and it's like their glorious moment. But because the Zouaves often wound up fighting the way ordinary infantry fought, or this is part of the reason, drill becomes really important in Zouave identity, right? Although that when it gets time to fire weapons, their autonomy is more limited. Drill is something that the individual organization had more control over, and they were able to be more flamboyant about. And a lot of Zouave regiments become showcase drill regiments, especially the 5th New York Duryea Zouaves. But it's also true of Wallace's Zouaves and a number of other ones. So showcase drill becomes another one of these bridges between the military and theater. Right. Because the drill is it's a kind of performance.
It just crossed my mind that I think it was in the whenever that idea of that military parade in Washington happened there in the late 2000s, and I think there was an article actually that I read that was like it was not going to happen because the U.S. military is not in its nature like the British or the French, having units that have sort of that drill kind of marching parade personality in it. So that was very interesting kind of to think about in modern times, how like European military is still very much also, while capable of fighting, also very much about the show, whereas the U.S. military has sort of lost that show aspect a little bit, I guess.
It's an interesting thought. I think you're right about that. Of course, the 20th century military becomes a more enclosed institution. But our book is the United States part is set in a period when Yeah, the military, especially again the militia, is putting on performances, and that's a big part of what they do for the
Yeah.
community, right? They represent the community on the 4th of July and other civic occasions and things like that. That's kind of one of the functions of the local militia.
Hmm.
Right?
Of course, of course. Um, so final military, and then we're going to get into the theatrics. um, Duncan Campbell and I also did like a transnational book shortly. I think came out a few weeks before your guys' book came out, and we looked at the warfare in the kind of in the frame of a modernizing war in the mid 19th century, sort of the Crimean to the Franco-German War, sort of like changes in the way we conduct military operations. It's not quite modern, but it's moving out of the kind of Napoleonic. So I kind of wondered how you see the Zouaves and sort of this change in military conduct, military style, battlefield strategy, and tactics as well, sort of.
Well, it's a significant decentralizing move, especially the French conception of the Zouave that we're going to deal with smaller units in which kind of local initiative on the battlefield is going to be more important. So it fit into what were in the from the 1830s and 40s on, these kind of seen as modernizing military ideas in the French army. They get picked up in the United States, in the militia and in the U.S. Army. This was not the only example of that. The chasseurs à pied was another seen as sort of a cutting edge organization, in which both of them they played very much into the idea that the soldier had to be fit, and they're related to sort of the gymnastics developments of the mid 19th century and the ways in which kind of army training becomes a gymnastic activity. So yeah, I think they fit into this idea of modernizing military ideas.
I would add, though, that the genealogy you gave there from the Crimea Civil War, Franco-Prussian War, is that in some ways the Zouaves are a little bit outside of that because they are colonial troops.
Yeah.
Right? They are absolutely France's colonial troops, and they are the foundation of the Zouaves in 1830 represents a real step toward the bifurcation of the French army. The Zouaves are a branch of the Armée d'Afrique, the African army. And they fight in the Crimea, and of course they fight in the Franco-Prussian War, but they are intended as colonial troops. And all the way through their history, primarily what they do is they create the French Empire. They serve around the empire, and they are fundamentally about building empire.
Right. Yeah, I have a little something where you're raising a great point that I want to get to in a moment because of the 1960s sort of relation in Algeria. But so we're talking about a unit that's created in Algeria and creates a French empire in Algeria. How does this get back to mainland France? How do the people in Paris all of a sudden become like interested in Zouaves?
Well, so the unit is created, the first unit is created in Algeria in 1830, almost as soon as the conquest happens. And the idea is, how are we going to garrison this new colony relatively cheaply and not relying on French conscripts, recognizing that it's going to be very difficult to conscript young men and then send them that far away and expect that to be effective. So the idea is we need a cheap way to garrison the new colony. The original plan was to have a mixed unit of native soldiers and French officers. That did not work very well in the first years of the French Empire in North Africa. They had real desertion problems. The deserters often took their weapons with them. So it sort of fueled resistance. And so very quickly, what emerges is a unit of French soldiers play acting at being natives with French officers. And the first, you see them occasionally in French theatrical spectacles in Paris in the 1830s and 40s, especially. There were quite a few theaters in Paris that specialized in sort of battle reenactments on stage. And Zouaves are quite popular there. And again, they look good. You see them in a lot of engravings of the period because they stand out, the color, the cut of the uniform. But they really make their splash, as it were, in Europe proper with the Crimean War. So they serve in the Crimea. This is their first time in combat against a European army. And this is the point when Napoleon III creates a Zouave unit of his Imperial Guard. So the 4th Zouave, or the unit of the Imperial Guard, and they become a very regular presence on the scene in Paris. So accompanying the emperor, and they really become part of the urban fabric, the urban spectacle of 19th century Paris. And that's really the moment when the Zouave is a sort of stock character. Zouaves in Parisian theaters. It's post Crimea that they really become sort of celebrities and part of the attraction of Paris.
So what do they do? Like, are these actually Zouaves, soldiers that go to the theater, or is this actors that put on Zouave uniforms?
No, it's the historic first 3 Zouave units go to the Crimea, and they are fighting in the Crimea. And so the theatrical tradition for Zouaves does actually start in the Crimea, and it is actual units. It's battlefront theater, which they're not the first. They don't invent that, but they make it very popular. And of course, it involves a fair bit of drag performance. Not because there are no women there. The cantinière, the vivandière, the Zouave vivandière is a popular figure. But at the Zouave Theater, she takes the ticket money. She doesn't actually perform on stage because it's too much fun to have, sort of burly, bearded Zouaves playing women's roles. That's a lot of the fun of the show. And so the battlefield theater becomes a really important part of Zouave lore, is that these guys are super fierce, but they are also ingenious, and they're good at foraging, and they can put on a show. And so the stories start circulating. Probably the most famous is of the play that's going on that Zouaves are performing in, and then they hear the Russians approaching. So the Zouaves kind of pull up their skirts and run out of the theater and take on the Russians in wigs and skirts. And this becomes an important part of their appeal. It is great. It is a lot of fun. And there is a real pretty direct pipeline between the Paris theater and the Crimean battlefront. So within months, there's a play being performed in Paris called the Zouave Theater that recreates that episode, right? In which you have Zouaves putting on a play. There's a play within a play with drag performance. And so there's this sort of direct pipeline from what's happening in the Crimea to what's happening on stage in Paris. And that continues into the post-war years. There is a troupe of Crimean War veterans. They call themselves the Inkerman Zouaves. Inkerman was their most famous battle in the Crimea. And they go on tour. They tour London, they tour France, and then they wind up in the United States. And they have a tour in the US. They're a drill company.
Wait, I'll have to look for Carol over to you there. Of like,
and then, well, the Inkerman, probably because she probably looked at me, because the Inkerman Zouaves go on tour in the United States, and they wind up in New Orleans just as Louisiana is seceding and mobilizing for war. And the Inkerman Zouaves play a role in New Orleans in recruitment, in getting people into units. Confederate, what will soon be Confederate units.
And they're advertising themselves. You should come see our show because we're going to show you tips.
Yeah, right, exactly.
We're going to show you tricks about how to be a soldier, how to be a Zouave soldier, which you will want to know.
Yes, exactly. So, yeah, so there's a great connection there between theater and war, in which, war takes tips from theater.
Yeah, but I did enjoy also how in your Civil War section, Thom, it was like the drill companies, like Elmer Ellsworth was like, he of course has a big one, but it seemed that in the United States were also a lot more women involved in sort of Zouave performances.
Yes, I think so. In some ways, the American Zouave builds on the French Zouave, but in some ways it develops in a different way.
Mm.
Ellsworth's, vision of spectacular, synchronized, precision drill
Mm.
was something that did not exist in France, right? They had um, initiative. They were supposed to be great at, climbing over hurdles
They're actually not good
and
at drilling.
barriers and things like that. But yes, exactly. They're not disciplined enough for drill.
Mhm.
So Ellsworth's, kind of the magic of Ellsworth is bringing together this idea of the empowerment of the individual soldier, but at the same time, a relative, it's that idea is in tension with the discipline that comes for this extreme precision drill.
Mm.
And that combination of things is really what makes Ellsworth so spectacular. And then he is just a phenomenon of the first order of magnitude in terms of kind of popular performance in America in 1860, and with imitators and spin-offs of all kinds, including women. And so the Seven Sisters, for example, which is just an incredibly successful proto musical throughout the Civil War, is built around Zouaves.
But
So-
women dressed.
Women, I'm sorry, yeah,
Women.
women, yes, with women dressed as Zouaves, yes, 40 women on stage doing a, kind of dance drill sort of thing.
It is kind of odd when you think about it, right? So in Zouave, France, you have bearded man dressed in women's clothes, and in the United States, you have women dressed in uniforms putting up drill.
You learn a little bit about the different stage traditions. The vaudeville in France, is more about popular song and this kind of character development, where the Zouave is this prototypical figure who's a romantic and a roue, and it lends itself to some of these guys, like the Inkerman Zouaves, become famous as singers. And in the United States, the Zouave fed more into a theatrical tradition that's about big time spectacle, really grand spectacle that is going to culminate in things like marching bands. One of our kind of like titles we threw around was that the Zouaves were America's first halftime show, and they were. It was like a halftime show, and so that's kind of an American strand of the Zouave.
But the everyone recognized there's the germ of it in the uniform, which is that the silhouette of the uniform is a certain gender ambiguity to it.
Yeah.
Right? The trousers that are so wide they could be skirts. And people talk about the Zouave petticoats, and observers in the Crimea talk about those trousers are so wide you could hide a pound of sausages or a baby in it. So the kind of ambiguity of the silhouette is there from the beginning, and so that the gender bending possibilities are there. The Zouave is fierce. He has this big beard, but he's also kind of wearing skirts, really.
Yeah. He's comfortable in everything.
Yeah,
that's right.
Which actually I just had. Gosh, I think I recorded it last week. It hasn't been published yet, but I had Shay Cox on the podcast with regard to her book on uniforms. So, and she has a brilliant section in there about women dressing as soldiers and passing off as men. Were there any women that dressed as Zouaves? Because, I mean, the uniform lends itself to that.
A few. I kind of looked for that. I would not say disproportionately. I don't think there's evidence that it was disproportionately true, but there are certainly cases of it. In terms of these women who are being discovered in the war trying to pass. So we identify a few cases. On the stage, on the other hand, it is the natural uniform of the woman soldier.
Yeah. And there were plenty of perfectly respectable, fashionable women.
Yes, that's
wearing
right.
Zouave dress, right?
That's
the
important.
Zouave jacket is a very
that's a wardrobe staple.
It is completely a wardrobe staple. So in the fashion press, there are stories that people love to tell about how shocking it is when this lady says, "Bring me my Zouave," but what she means is her new jacket. It's a total fashion staple of respectable, well-dressed women.
Yes, you don't have to be a performer to wear Zouave jackets.
Yeah,
sort of like the Navy outfits in the late 19th century.
Yes.
Good,
Like a
yes,
sailor
good
suit.
analogy, like a sailor suit,
And
exactly.
in fact, very much like a sailor suit, even when adult women stopped wearing them, children, they continue to be
Yeah.
children's clothes
Right,
Oh yeah.
through the end of the century.
right.
So it's not in the book, unfortunately, but there's a lovely photograph of Theodore Roosevelt, aged about 3.
Yeah, 4, yeah.
Teddy Roosevelt, aged 4, in a Zouave outfit.
Yeah.
And he's completely precious. He's the cutest he would ever be.
Well, I mean, it went downhill from there. So.
Yeah. But a Zouave uniform, like a sailor suit,
Yeah.
persists as clothing for children.
Wow. Well, I mean, it's a big cultural impact they have. So, um, right. We're gonna circle back a little bit, because there was something that you raised, Carol, with regard to the Zouaves and Algeria, France as sort of a connection. And I had that when I was reading your book, and I was not, I mean, I've studied Napoleon III little bit. I've studied obviously 48 quite a bit. And I knew of Cavagnat and his kind of intermezzo there as an interim president, but I was never aware that he had been in Algeria and fought with the Zouaves. And it, in that moment, it dawned on me sort of this relationship, right? Of like, here's individuals who fought in Algeria in a very brutal, demeaning war, and now they're bringing that very attitude potentially to the streets of Paris, fighting workers instead of Algerian natives. And it sort of reminded me of like, I mean, we could look at it like bring Thom in, sort of Nelson Miles, that brings in sort of like I fought Southerners and I fought natives and I fought workers, and I kind of correlate all of that in the United States. But then also like the generals of the War of Independence on Algeria in the 50s and 60s with regard to France, and kind of what they are bringing then as ideological baggage from Algeria to France. So big one, take what you like out of it.
Well, certainly, this bifurcation of the French army that I think I mentioned earlier, where you have a domestic army, you have the metropolitan army composed largely of conscripts. They never get sent very far from home. They garrison European France, and the African army, which is really that builds the empire. For ambitious officers, the African army is the way to go, right? That's where the battlefield promotions are. That's where the action is in the 19th century. And so, yes, the men who make really successful military careers, like General Cavaignac, like Lamoricière, like Duvivier, they have all been in Algeria, right? They have all been trained in Algeria, and in an era like 1848, when the urban policing there's more of it in France than there is in other European countries, but still the idea of an urban police force that can maintain public order is pretty, it doesn't exist. So that public order, the maintenance of public order, becomes a task for the army. And so, yes, in the June days in 1848, they are maintaining order as they would in Algeria, and it is absolutely brutal. And they are fighting Parisian workers. Jumping ahead with the Algerian War, that is the end for the Zouave, because there's really no way. The Zouave is so closely connected with French Algeria that it has really no path post Algerian independence. And in particular, the Zouave are so closely connected with white settlers in French Algeria that they become associated with the resistance to independence, with Pied Noir, with the OAS, the Secret Army Organization, that there is no path forward for them. So yeah, they are disbanded completely with the independence of Algeria. They are so closely tied to white Algeria and French Algeria.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting situation when the imperial project flounders and you have to abandon that identity. So, but we're still an empire, and we have Napoleon III now in the. So, Napoleon is about theater, right? It's like theatrics of empire. We have to present, like, monarchy is often about theatrics. And the section I really also enjoyed in your book was the artistic and the photographic, the visual, right? Because I guess you made a good contract with LSU that you got to include pictures.
They're good. We had lots of pictures. Yes, lots of pictures.
Yeah.
It's an important part of the book.
Yeah. It would be hard to write about a history of the Zouave uniform without pictures because they inspired so many artists.
Mm-hmm.
And what we love about them is that the Zouave are right on the cusp. So the mid 19th century is the moment when you see the last really big battle paintings,
Mm-hmm.
big paintings of, the idea that the battlefield is sort of, you can stand at the general's point of view and you can see the battlefield and it's legible from that perspective. The last of those really come out of the mid 19th century, and the first photography, the first war photography is there too. And the Zouaves are in both, right? So they are the stars of the last big battle canvases from the Crimean War, but they are also the stars of the first war photography.
Mm-hmm.
And for us, that's such a great moment that both art forms found this idea of individuality and initiative really exciting and inspiring. And both the painters, I think, and the photographers thought that this notion of Zouave performance was really, they found it very productive.
Sure. Visual artists of all kinds looking towards theater there, partly.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
So, trick question, I suppose. Does the uniform make them more appealing, or is there war heroics, or is there antics? What makes them more appealing as sort of a image that you put on canvas or put on a glass?
It's hard to separate, because it's about, I like to say that, that it's not just a uniform, it's a costume,
Mm-hmm.
and so that it comes, packed with these implications of what the Zouave is. When we came, when you index your book, you really come to know it well. And we wound up, we're doing the index entry about Zouave, and we're like characteristics of the Zouave. And we came up with, like several dozen characteristics of the Zouave.
Mm.
Many things are implied, and sometimes quite directly implied by the uniform.
Yeah. So if you are writing a play or you are producing a picture and you put a Zouave in it,
it's very economical.
It's a very economical way to, it gives you a full characterization already, right? The 19th century viewer knows that this guy is probably a little rough around the edges. He's a womanizer. He likes his drink.
He's sassy.
He's sassy. He respects competence more than rank. The viewer knows a whole set of things about him, and you haven't had to do that exposition at all.
Yeah, there's a benefit to that. But I also noticed there were a couple of photographs that you had of individuals who dressed just as Zouaves for portrait purposes, correct?
Well, the first war photographer, so Roger Fenton, widely known as the first war photographer, he was a British photographer who worked in the Crimea. And Fenton produced an album of Crimean views and sold them. They were very popular. And several of his images are of Zouave, except, of course, he was limited by exposure times in the 1850s, right? They're not actual, battlefield images. And many of them are, in fact, pictures of him taken in his studio in London, dressed as a Zouave, right? So he puts on the costume and he sort of poses as if he's like ready to go into battle. But it's a studio shot, and he is pretending to be a Zouave.
Yeah, it's great.
And yeah, it's another kind of performance.
Yeah, it seems like a lot about the Zouaves is about performance.
Yep.
And which is things I want that draws me over to. Yes, I want to go to Ellsworth for that, because I think it was very early on when I was starting to read and research and kind of learn about the American Civil War that I kind of encountered that picture of him coming down the stairs in Alexandria and getting shot. And I always remember like these big bayonets that they had in their drawings and their photographs. So how much is that also kind of part of the like? I mean, obviously he's already showman because of the drill teams that he has, and how much is that kind of part like the appeal of like this look of the Zouave? I have to look a certain way.
Well, so, I mean, Ellsworth generally, of course, had a huge role in popularizing the Zouaves in America. That tour in the summer of 1860, he's attracting crowds of 10,000, fifteen
Mm,
thousand people in some places to watch the United States Zouave cadets tour,
mm,
try to watch them drill. And that played a tremendous role in the popularization of the Zouaves. And then his death, you know, it produced, you know, it's the first martyr of the war. There are people who, you know, call for revenge and vindication of Zouave. There's a group called, you know, Ellsworth's Avengers. These are naturally going to be, you know, Zouave groups,
mhm,
right? So, yes, in his life and in his death, Ellsworth's a key figure in popularizing the Zouave.
mm,
I guess one thing I would say, but add to that, you know, in getting back to your point about, you know, in what ways are the Zouaves modern, in what ways are they not modern, and you know, the Civil War is, you know, it's got bits of both. The Civil War is a war, by and large, of volunteers.
mhm,
And as Carol mentioned, getting people to be part of the Imperial War Army in France is predominantly a matter of volunteers.
mhm,
And if we think of, you know, if modernity in the military context is going to culminate in World War I with full-scale conscript armies,
mm,
in that sense, the Zouaves are not so not so
right.
modern, right? They're the part of the importance of Zouaves is people wanted to be Zouaves.
Mm,
It was a way to get people into the army. And so, in the context of mobilization in the Civil War, you're some guy who wants to be a captain
mm,
or some guy who wants to be a colonel, then, well, part of your strategy might be I'm going to have a Zouave company, I'm
mm,
going to have a Zouave regiment, I'm going to be able to bring in 100 guys or 1,000
mm,
guys, right? So they're part of a world of volunteer armies.
mm. Yeah, as you were thinking, I kind of was thinking of like all these advertisements of the US militaries that you see on TV, right? Of like, how do you make a person volunteer to go into a war? You appeal today to their masculinity, to their desire to serve, and like a Zouave uniform.
Yep. Yep, you'll look sharp, you know, you're not just, you know, and especially as opposed to, you know, think about the, you know, what the alternatives are. You know, to be in a unit where I don't know, you're more of a company man, as it were, you,
Hmm.
right? You were
Yeah,
it's just this, you know, we're going to be guys who are kind of out there on the edge.
yeah.
And so there's a range of Zouave organizations in the Civil War, but it's not surprising that some of them are these kind of rough guys,
Hmm.
like Billy Wilson's Zouaves, or the Fire Zouaves, Ellsworth's company, the
Hmm.
Fire Zouaves. You know, there's a strong connection between volunteer fire companies
Hmm.
and volunteering to be a Zouave, and there's some of the same ethos involved in, you know, the things that make someone want to be an active volunteer fireman are the same things that are going to send that guy into a Zouave unit in the war.
So I just came back to when you said that, I was thinking of like New York, right? 1850s firefighters that like fight each other in the street of who gets to put out the
Exactly.
fire and then
That's right.
plunder it, and it does sort of a feel of what is going on in Algeria, I guess, like kind of personality wise.
To some extent, I mean, there's, you know, the whole French and Algeria thing doesn't have a very exact analogy in the mid 19th century United States. I mean, in terms of the, you know, maintenance of urban order, there's, you know, there is military maintenance of urban order that the militia is exercising. The Seventh New York, which is going to be an important kind of Zouave seedbed, is at the very center of that, right? This the Seventh New York that's shooting these people at the Astor Place riot. On the other hand, they asked the guy who threw the first chair in the Astor Place riot at the stage is Billy Wilson, who's also going to become a Zouave. So you get Zouaves on both sides. There are Zouaves who are the kind of the tough guys who were whatever the source of urban disorder. On the other hand, there were people who thought the Zouave, they were kind of military perfectionists, military progressives. People like Abram Duryea, who thought, oh, this is where military thought is going. They were the kind of agents of urban order. They both wind up being Zouaves.
Back to Carol, because we're getting back to Europe slowly with the story of your book. And so you mentioned earlier briefly that the Crimean War is important, but the campaigns in Italy are also a part that makes the Zouave popular in Europe. And that kind of is a really, when I kind of think of this period, right, there's a lot of different factors that pull and push this period in different directions. And obviously the desire for nation states is a huge one. Like, I mean, it's in the South, it's in Italy. And here you have the French Zouaves fighting alongside the Italians to create the Italian nation state against the Austrians. And then you turn around a decade later and you have the Papal Zouaves who are doing the exact opposite in defense of a very conservative world order.
And an anti-national one.
Internationalist order, yes.
Yeah. Well, yeah. The Zouave as a kind of uniform of the nation state is they do become sort of a symbol of France in the Crimea and of France in the Italian campaign. There are other French soldiers, but the Zouaves soak up a lot of the publicity. It is not coincidental that in both wars, they share the limelight with other well-dressed examples of their allies. So the Crimean War generates all of these stories about Zouave and Highlander. So Zouaves and Highland soldiers in the British Army. And the Highlanders are sort of like Zouaves, right? They're sort of in fancy dress. They're from the periphery of the nation state. Their level of civilization is perhaps a bit questionable. They like their drink and so on and so forth. So a lot of the Crimean Zouave lore is built around the idea that Zouave and Highlander are buddies. And there's, in fact, an extremely popular play that shows in Paris called Zouave and Highlander. In Italy, something very similar happens with the Bersagliere soldier taking the place of the Highlander. So the soldier with his very grand feather hat. And so there are stories of Zouave and Bersagliere going to the photographic studio to be, sort of a picture with their buddies. So on the one hand, yes, it becomes a sort of symbol of the French army, just as Highlander or Bersagliere come to represent other national armies. Of course, the campaign to protect the Papal States is an anti-national one, right? It is asserting the importance of international transnational Catholicism against the forces of the Italian Risorgimento. And there, the Zouave uniform arrives partly in homage to French Algeria, and especially to the French general, one of the generals I mentioned earlier, Lamoricière, who makes his career in French Algeria, and then who returns and serves the Second Republic, but who refuses to serve Napoleon III. He refuses to serve Louis Napoleon when he's elected president of the Second Republic, and he goes into exile, kind of returns to the faith of his fathers, and offers his services to the Pope. And so the Zouave uniform is sort of an homage to this highly successful general who has come to serve papal Rome. But it is also, by 1860, it's a uniform that everybody recognizes, that everybody wants to wear. And there is a certain appeal, I think, in papal Rome to the subverting of the Zouave lore, right? That the pontifical Zouave is not, He's not ill-disciplined. He's not a womanizer. He doesn't drink too much. He is a young man. He is serving his God. He would never go to the theater. He certainly does not drink too much. And there's a little sort of frisson involved in this kind of godly young man preparing for martyrdom, but dressed as a Zouave.
Yeah. I'll go with my admission first, and then I'll go back to another saying. But when I started reading that chapter, the first thing I thought was about to happen is that you were going to introduce the Swiss Guards, because they also have those colorful baggy pants, right?
Yeah.
Like, of course, that weird helmet and weird top that isn't very Zouave. But I kind of, for a moment, I was like expecting like this is about to happen, and then you had this very gray, very dark group of people. So, like that. So that, yeah, that.
Yeah, the Swiss Guard, that dress is much older, and it still survives, of course, but it's a much older tradition. The Zouave, the Zouaves in the Papal Army, it's much briefer.
And they don't
they're there
last
for the
long.
1860s. Well, I mean, Papal Rome falls in 1870, so that's the end of it.
Yeah.
Now, I had not appreciated when I started working on this the extent to which pontifical Zouaves sort of have a life after the fall of Papal Rome. A lot of them regroup and they serve in the Franco-Prussian War, and some of them even regroup up after that and go to Spain to serve the Carlist pretender in Spain.
Yeah.
But they really do create a kind of alternate Zouave tradition, so that the Zouave also across Catholic Europe and the Americas sort of calls to mind this Catholic figure as well as at the same time, and that they're sort of related as like negative images.
So there has to be a successful symbol, you have to have a certain amount of flexibility. You have to achieve a certain definiteness and a certain flexibility, and the Zouave managed to pull that off. It was a pliable, variable engine, but it maintained enough specificity to remain coherent.
Yeah, and as you were talking, I was also thinking of like this is an era of these really fanciful uniforms that have huge impact, right? It's like you have Zouave in Italy, you have the Papal Zouave, you have Garibaldi and his red shirts, and it's all these like colorful figures of this that makes this period so lively in many ways.
Yeah. It's, I think, a very interesting counterpoint to what is a very standard narrative in fashion history, which is about the era of the great masculine renunciation, right? The era of the black business suit. And that's an enormously influential argument in fashion history. And it basically says that late 18th, early 19th century, especially early 19th century, men give up color, decoration, ornament, and kind of these elaborate sartorial pleasures. You renounce that, and what you get in return with your black business suit is a sort of presumption of rectitude, of seriousness, of virtue. And there's a lot to be said for that, but I think it's important that it has an escape clause, right? There are still outlets for men to dress up. And the military is a really important one. And in the 19th century, it just flowers. Because this is the era, yes, of the Bersagliere uniform, of the Highlander, of many of these, of Irish soldiers wearing bright green uniforms. These kinds of uniforms really flower in the 19th century. So the Great Male Renunciation is not as complete as we might think.
Comment about, I mean, Garibaldi pops up in the US every now and then, or Jubal Early, AP Hill likes to dress in red, and
there were certainly in the Civil War people who like to dress up in a variety of ways, of which the Zouave is one, broad institutional example. But you can point to all kinds of individuals, like Francis Channing Barlow would wear like red checked shirts and things like that. And people had their personal trademarks of various kinds. So yeah, there was plenty of room for flamboyance in terms of Civil War dress.
Indeed. I think it's also a really interesting curiosity moment, right? Where you have like the Papal Zouaves in Rome are fighting the Italian nation state to keep Rome independent under papal authority. At the same time, French Zouaves, I would assume, fight in France against the Prussians, trying to keep the empire alive. So you have, I guess, in that case, two nation states clashing, or in a very similar way, a conservative sort of state trying to maintain its power against the boiling German nation state. So it's an interesting moment in time that you have Zouaves
Well, there were
fighting
interesting
this.
negotiations around the uniform in the Franco-Prussian War because, of course, the French Zouave units are called from
Hmm.
Algeria, from North Africa, to serve in Europe. But also, many of the pontifical Zouaves, especially the French, but not exclusively, agree to go fight Protestant Prussia in the French army. And there's a negotiation because they basically agree to do it on condition that they get to keep their uniforms.
Hmm.
And they insist that like this is the Pope's livery and we will not give it up. Understandably, the French army's position is no, this is our uniform, we invented this. But they accept the idea that these volunteers of the West, which is what they're called, a lot of them came from Western France, from Brittany. They accept that these volunteers of the West will be integrated into the French army, but wearing their pontifical gray Zouave uniforms. And so there are two kinds of Zouaves in the French army in the Franco-Prussian War, and then a good number of the pontifical Zouaves go fight in Spain, where they actually tell their friends, like, come join us, bring your uniform, because they never did get supply lines together in sufficiently to provide people with new uniforms. So make sure you bring your old uniform so that we can be Zouaves in this combat together.
Yeah, I was struck by that back to Thom of like how they actually went to order uniforms for American Zouaves in Paris.
There were yes, there was some there as a prize for drill excellence, which again speaks to at least the post-Ellsworth American imagination. The Zouave equals drill excellence. They were going to give out French uniforms. But during the war, in the kind of meat and potatoes of the war, those uniforms are being made. Of course, uniforms are produced in a variety of ways, but those uniforms are being made in these big uniform making enterprises in Philadelphia. Hey, if guys wanted to fight being Zouaves, then the army was glad to have them. The army wanted soldiers.
So leaving aside the obvious color problems that we get in modern times, with red not being great camouflage color, the soldiers fighting in it say that these uniforms are very comfortable. So why didn't we adopt it more broadly?
Well, in the United States context, the basic story of the decline, then the basic story of the decline of the Zouave has to do with the direction of the militia after the war. During the war, there was discussion about changing the uniform, the standard issue uniform of the United States Army's infantry, in a direction that would have made it look more like a French chasseur uniform. In other words, in a way that would have incorporated some of this, flexibility of movement. After the war, there's a kind of nationalist recoil. This idea we're going to be like France turns downward after Union victory in the Civil War. Of course, after the French defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, the French stock really drops in American military thought. And so when the uniform is revised after the war, before the Franco-Prussian War, this idea that, well, we're going to adapt some of the French chasseur uniform that didn't fly, that didn't have as much traction after the war as it did during the war. But anyhow, the basic story, the decline of the uniform in the United States, the Zouave uniform, is that, as I say, its institutional base was the militia and then the U.S. volunteers. When the war ends, its institutional base becomes the militia again. And it had a great deal of grassroots popularity. There were plenty of units that wanted to wear Zouave uniforms and that were embraced by their communities. But there comes to be a reform movement in the United States militia that is the basic story that is going to result in it becoming the National Guard. And that reform movement is in favor of saying we ought to focus less on the role of the militia as community representative, fewer parades, more shooting practice. And we ought to make the militia as integrated with the United States Army as the United States Army will go for. The United States Army at many points is like, we'd just assume the militia disappeared. But eventually the militia doesn't want to disappear. And there are important figures in the militia who foresee that its path to survival and flourishing, as the National Guard flourishes in the United States, is going to be close integration with the U.S. Army. And an important early stage of that integration is stamping out the Zouave uniform, right? The militia is going to look like the U.S. Army. And so that is what drives the Zouave out of the American military establishment, broadly speaking, the militia, that is. As these reformers say, we got to look like the U.S. Army, we got to wear the blue uniform. And after that, the Zouave uniform gets driven into more exclusively entertainment, including entertainments that are drill entertainments. And for a while there's some overlap between those showcase drills and militia outfits, militia organizations. But gradually, the militia organization wearing Zouave uniforms are suppressed, and it becomes strictly entertainment.
And you said in France they use them for dress uniforms still.
Well, in France, they are in standard use until the First World War. Zouave wear Zouave uniforms. The First World War, the red trousers is not the only problem with the uniform in the First World War. The uniform is really just not suited to living in Northern Europe. A jacket that doesn't button up.
Bit cold.
It's cold, yes, which is fine in much of France's colonial territory, but not so much in northern France. And so the First World War is when the French army, like other European armies, really kind of moves to a very uniform silhouette that's basically an overcoat of some sort, right? Trench coat of some sort. And it's also the moment when armies begin to wear helmets. So, a Zouave fez and turban is no good. And all of the armies in the First World War are doing studies about head injuries and
artillery is so much more important in World War I.
Yeah, and thinking about designing helmets. And so in all of the European armies, the silhouette just kind of gets much more uniform, and it's basically an overcoat and a helmet.
So you had some really nice pictures in that last chapter, so sort of like thinking about like the demise. And since we are recording this, I'm not sure if Italy does much in that. We're recording this in Carnival season. So how popular is the Zouave uniform in France during Carnival season still?
I have no idea. In France today, it is largely folkloric. Post Algeria, it is basically dead. Yeah.
There's the phrase,
Yeah, it's that's a good point. It sort of lasts in terms of some slang phrases. Fais pas le Zouave is something that parents will still tell their children. Don't act like a Zouave, which is like behave yourself.
Okay.
Stop acting like a little hoodlum. There's also a nice phrase that something can be like la main de ma sœur dans le pantalon d'un Zouave. So my sister's hand in a Zouave's trousers. Meaning, like, how dare you say such a thing about my sister? But
Mm.
on the other hand, that does sound kind of like her.
Mm.
That so you still, but the fait pas le zouave, the admonishing children is probably where you mostly hear it these
Mm.
days. That, and there is one sort of relic of the Second Empire in the city of Paris. So the bridge that has the zouave against one of the bridge pilings. And when it was built as part of Napoleon III's renovation of the city of Paris, it had different soldiers of different units on all the pilings. The one that survives is the Zouave. And that is how Parisians measure set flooding of the Seine. So, how high does the water get on the statue of the Zouave? So that's probably the where you
Right.
see Zouave still today. Yeah.
Okay, well, subsea for the Third Empire is still useful. That's great. Oh my goodness. So what final question for tonight or for this evening? What was the most fun thing to find as you did the research for this book?
The most fun thing to
Well, the
find.
Teddy Roosevelt
The
photo
Teddy
is pretty
Roosevelt
great,
picture is pretty cool.
which is funny that it's not in the book.
It was with great
But
reluctance that it didn't make the cut. Wow, hard to say. I think personally, finding out, it's hard to pick one, but I would choose that when Ellsworth, with tremendous fanfare, the country is mobilizing for war. There are just, hundreds of thousands of people getting ready to fight. And the highest profile instance of organization really is what is Elmer Ellsworth going to do? And Ellsworth comes up with this spectacular idea of, forming this regiment of New York City firefighters. And they depart from New York for the front with just incredible fanfare. And that part of that fanfare is that Laura Keene, the star the impresario behind the Seven Sisters and the star of the show, presents Ellsworth with a ceremonial flag and gives him that flag with a note that begins like "Brother Zouaves." And I love the idea that Laura Keene is like, from one Zouave, because she plays a Zouave on the stage. She sings Dixie as a Zouave. From one Zouave to another, I give you this flag. Finding that I thought was just encapsulated the interplay between theater and war for me.
And I guess what I will pick is kicking around and then choosing the cover image.
Oh, okay.
Because we spent a lot of time debating this, right? It's it's a book about France, it's a book about the United States, it's a book about other places, and choosing a cover image. It was a bit like, the debates over choosing images for the new Euro bills years ago, like which country are you going to put on the bill? And France won, I will say. But I love the image on the cover because they're toy soldiers. So it's a sheet of paper soldiers. Paper soldiers you would cut out and then you'd paste them on cardboard and then you'd stand them up and you would have your little army. And they were the cheaper predecessor to tin soldiers. And so I love them because it makes this connection between the world of play and the world of the army. And it also, I think, gets at the ways in which, on the one hand, they are kind of individuals. You were an autonomous soldier, but you are still, you're a mass-produced product. And I also love the fact that the French printers who made these toy soldiers always included, when they made Zouaves, they included women. So that the vivandières are there in the toy soldier lineup, and you would have vivandières as you played war with your Zouave.
Yes, I did like that one addition there in the bottom. It's oh, it speaks to the very much industrial new age that the
Yeah.
Zouaves are operating in. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, with that, thank you so much for taking the time today, Carol and Tom. And just for everyone, this is Zouave Theater, Transnational Military Fashion and Performance, and available at LSU's Press's website or various other places. And I'm very certain you guys are presenting the book in various places too at some point.
Yeah. And thanks very much.
Thank you very much for
This has
having us
been fun.
on your podcast today.
You are so welcome, and thanks for taking the time.
It's a pleasure. Mhm.